Oh, well, that's new.
Yeah. Okay.
Hello, guys. Here I am with Lamont from Days of French and Swedish. How you doing, Lamont?
Yeah. Good. Thanks, mate. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing quite well. I'm really excited for this interview. I got to say that in like early 2020, like January, I kind of got the urge to uh, go a little beyond with language channels and check out some new people. And your channel is one of the ones I found, and I've really liked it since then. And I gotta say, I let's say I grew up on the classics, the Steves, Moseses, the Lucas. But as far as like this, what I consider to be kind of like a new generation, I gotta say I've really, really enjoyed your channel. So thank you for being on, my friend.
Yeah. Thanks for saying so. And no worries. Yeah. Happy to be here.
So we have to do the mandatory introduction. You don't need to go too in depth. I'm not gonna put you through that
Hmm.
again, but take the floor, please.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I live in Australia. I have lived here my whole life. I've rarely been overseas. Haven't been overseas for a long time now. Um, and almost 5 years ago now, I sort of decided almost on a whim to learn Swedish. But I didn't really take it that seriously. It, I almost kind of acknowledged that it was a bit of a whim and that it probably wouldn't last. Little did I know that it was going to become like my next thing because I often do, like kind of get into things like really hardcore for uh, short amounts of time, being like 3 to 4 years. So yeah, after about a year, I got a little bit bored of Swedish. I was pretty what's the word? I was pretty happy with my progress, not knowing that I actually kind of sucked. So I got a bit bored and I took up French, and I kind of fooled myself into thinking I was learning both at the same time for a bit over 2.5 years, and my Swedish got a little bit better in that time. My French obviously improved from nothing to existent. Um, and then just over a year ago now, so this is like April 2020, I was like, I'm not going to be good at either of these languages if I don't just focus on one. So I decided to drop all pretense of learning two at the same time and drop French, and I've just been focused on Swedish ever since. And I also, it was about that same time that I adopted a kind of Matt versus Japan, or mass input kind of methodology, um, of just listening and reading a lot, not necessarily not speaking, but um, and so yeah, I kind of re-kicked my obsession into Swedish that had kind of waned a bit. So now I've actually been into it for a total of 4.5 years, but really focused for about 2.5 of those years.
Wow,
Yeah.
wonderful, thank you. And I wanted to start kind of off with a lighter question, but it's a question I
Hmm.
haven't asked anybody before.
Okay.
You said that you took German in high school, correct?
Yep. Yes.
And if I remember correctly, the teacher said, "I'll give you a passing grade, just never come to class again." Is that true?
No, not exactly. She didn't. She actually doesn't have the authority to give me a passing grade in Australia in final year. That's not how it works. Like you
Uh,
get marked entirely separately by a whole She's not allowed to grade us. Um, so she didn't say that she would let me pass the what we call the higher school certificate, which is final year. She just said, I'm not going to report you to the school for what we call wagging, or sometimes called jigging, skipping.
ah,
Truancy is the proper word. Um, and yeah, I gave the wrong impression in that video that it was like as if I just kind of turned up one day and was a bit of an idiot in one class and then she was like out. But
oh,
that's not like, it was going on 3 years at this point because I'd actually studied it in year 9, year 10, year 11, and year 12. And year 9 was the only year that I wasn't like a total idiot in it. And like, um, particularly one student and I had this whole like sort of game that we played um, by ourselves, or like where we just weren't there to study German at all, um, and it just became this snowball effect where it's like we started associating German class with like the time that we had fun and played our little kind of game that we made up, um, and my German never ever progressed, and the class was on to some like pretty serious stuff by this point because she was actually quite a good teacher,
Mm.
and she believed in less traditional approaches. She believed more in like watching German movies and
Wow.
speaking a lot, which is okay. Maybe I don't agree with that now, but like it's better than what they do in school, which is like, this is a verb, this is a noun. And so
Mm.
we were expected to know all that stuff by then. Ich bin, du bist. You meant to know, like that was meant to be down pat. And the top students had it down. They spoke actually pretty good German.
Wow.
The two top students. I mean, not like really good, but
As far as high school is expected.
exactly. They could read in German, for example, like read a basic novel kind of thing, and I could barely even say that I spoke German for real. Um, and so it was ongoing for many years that I just came to class as a show, really. And yeah, one day she just kind of said, "Look, you're not, you're only taking away from others' progress." And
Wow.
she was like, why don't you just not come, like, and it was totally a choice. She didn't say like you can't come.
Hmm.
um but yeah, it made total sense, but it didn't actually last because I forget exactly why, but like I had to be somewhere in the school grounds during that time,
Right.
and so teachers would be like, "You don't have a free period right now, Lamont. Like, what are you doing?" And then I couldn't kind of dob her in and say, "Well, she gave me permission to just
Uh-huh.
not come to class," because that would get her in massive trouble. So I was always ducking it, and I was like, "Oh, fine. I just go back to class, and I just won't disturb anyone." Uh, and I also got a bit of a kick of motivation towards the end of like right towards the end of final year when I was supposed to have like known all my stuff. I
Uh-huh.
actually did put in some effort uh, in German only, really. So this wasn't just German, by the way. This is all my classes. I did not give a crap about school at all. Like I
Oh,
was a
wow.
terrible student. So
I would have thought the complete opposite because basically I was that person too. What you just described, I was that
yeah,
person. I had classes that I liked and that I did fairly well at, but then there were
yeah.
classes like math that just like, all right, what's that? Forget it. Don't like it. And I did really terrible.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, music was the one that I paid the most attention in, uh, but even that was like new for me, and because actually, yeah, I'd never been into it. I hadn't properly played music or anything before that, and that was kind of my obsession back then. That was my thing that I was into, was music, and that's what I ended up going to do at university.
What instrument?
Um, at the time, I played guitar and piano.
Wow.
I got I hadn't learned piano, but I got really obsessed with it, like again, which meant that it quickly overtook my guitar just because of how much effort I put in, um, despite having never had lessons or anything. And I was wrongly, incorrectly seen as like a freak because people are like, you haven't had lessons, you're like amazing,
Oh
and it's
my.
like, yeah, but I do this for like 5 hours a day. Like, like whenever I'm not at school, I'm playing piano, and often when I am at school, I'm in a practice room playing piano as well. Um, yeah, and then so I did at uni, but I actually did composition at uni, so I didn't have to play
Okay.
anything because compared to like a properly trained musician from like who starts from like 5 years old, I was rubbish at piano and still am. Like I'm good enough to look like, oh, he plays piano, but any proper pianist is like, not really.
I got you.
Yeah.
Oh, you said something interesting about like the fact that you would always find a new thing. I was wondering how many like new things you had, because for me, I would say that I was the complete opposite. I'm like the kind of guy that finds one thing and like I go all in. So like from 13 to 22, my thing was being a distance runner, and
Hmm.
in that time, I had a really nice progression, really nice. And basically, I started as like a kid who, probably had some, a bit of talented, just a bit, but more of a product of working hard. And by the time the end of my career came, I was the best on my, let's say, cross country team. My final year at a Division I university, which is, in American collegiate athletics, that's the highest one. So
Mm.
just to give you an idea of my timeline.
Yeah, yeah.
And after that, I started like writing poetry. I'm like, these would actually make good song lyrics. So I'm like, let me learn the guitar. And that became like my thing up until 2014 when I moved to Mexico. Then all of a sudden, languages became that thing.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
would say that I've had like three kind of real big passions in my life.
Yeah, I wish I'd held anything for that long. In school, mine were generally 2 years, and probably in my 20s, they were like 3 years. And now I'm sort of trying to find ways to almost trick myself into, and sorry if you can hear my son in the background, but I'm trying to find ways to trick myself into holding something out for longer. So thankfully now my Swedish is at a level where I can explore other things in Swedish. So I'm kind
Excellent.
of I'm almost kind of trying to find a new like and a new topic of interest, but in Swedish, so
Of
that
course.
I'm actually trying to get to a level in one thing where I could be more articulate about that in Swedish than I am in English. Because, like, I've never talked about XYZ in English,
Of course.
but I still haven't found that thing.
So my first real question is, there's many stories of people like that, of not having success in high school language classes, and even their teachers telling them very demotivating things, like there's many cases of this. Do you think in your case, there was a bit of that came back around when you did decide to learn the language, that you're like, oh, this experience in high school, and all of a sudden you're like, no, I want to show myself that I can learn a language. I'm not garbage, that, you know.
Um, a little bit, except that it was never a case that I didn't believe in myself or thought I was bad at languages. In fact, I would say I actually thought I was pretty good at German considering the amount of work I did, which is true. Like, this sounds really cocky, but I would have been top in the class. I would have totally topped that class if I'd even done like half the amount of work as them, because I have a really good ear. Like, that came back in the music thing.
Wow.
In music university, I was like top of the class in listening exams, which is like listening exams in music college make German listening exams look like preschool. Like in terms of the detail you have to hear. So yeah, I would have been quite good at German. So I never thought I was bad at languages. I just knew that I hadn't put in any effort. So yes, you're right. It was a little bit of that, but it was more to convince myself that I could devote myself to something. And so Swedish was almost like a clean slate, in that I was kind of bitter about my own effort with German, and was like, why didn't I take that opportunity more? I could have become quite good at German. And for that reason, I was like, no, I don't want to, maybe German later, but let's see if I can learn Swedish. And I knew there was some similarity there, but and then a few things just convinced me that Swedish was kind of cool anyway, um like the fact that there are no verb tenses, or everyone has the same verb tense.
Wow.
I was like, this is just a better language than German anyway. Like, so yeah.
Okay. One of the most interesting ways that I felt that I've learned like about Russian, or how Russian works, is just by listening to how my Russian students speak English to me, and then they'll reveal the language basically,
Yep.
And when it came time for me to use those same situations, it was just like like it was just like boom. Even if I'd never really saw it before, it was just like, okay. Like they'll say something like, when you will come to Moscow, you should,
Mm.
like they'll use this future tense.
Yep.
Have you
Yeah.
learned Swedish any way like that, or picked up on how they use the language, how they spoke English to you? Were you able to revert it back?
I don't know. I don't know that it's actually made a difference to how I speak or write Swedish, but I've certainly noticed that the mistakes that Swedes make are very Swedish mistakes,
Mm,
and are probably much more noticeable to me than they are to most people, because Swedes are famous for having this very high level of English. Um, and if they do make, well, they do make mistakes that natives wouldn't make. I want to point out that's a different kind of mistake. Um, but it's often in these like little bit more complex sentences, and they'll say something and I'm like, yeah, if you were that would be right in Swedish. And it's often on things that they don't need to worry about in Swedish, like verb
mm,
tenses. So like all of the people who are here are having a good time. They might say something like, all of the people who's here is having a good time. Um,
mm,
because it's like to them, they only needed to worry about if it's
right.
the verb to be. Um, and then there's a few other ones that are a bit more high level, like just certain words that aren't that they're not translating properly, if that or they're translating in the wrong context, like they're calling something a house when it's an apartment building, or that's a made
Uh,
up example, but yeah. um um because I can never think of these examples on the spot, but yes, a little bit. And it's like a native English speaker who doesn't speak another language will just like auto correct that. All of the people who's here is having a good time. They don't even hear it because they're like, no,
right, right.
all of the people who are here.
And
But I hear
honestly,
it and I'm like,
that could be a native mistake too, like in my opinion.
yeah, if there's a big, that's something I've noticed. The further you have to separate the who's doing the thing and the verb, the further those are separated by, the more likely it is that anyone will
Right,
make a mistake, including myself. But for Swedes, it's just a little thing. Like it only has to be separated by a bit.
right.
And I've even spoken to one Swedish woman who said something. For some, I wasn't correcting her, but I did bring up that mistake later and said, like, that's something. I'm sorry about that car if that's really loud.
No, I didn't hear
Um,
it.
okay, that's good. Yeah, I said like, oh, that's something that almost all Swedes do, and she was like, yeah, that's right, isn't it? And I was like, no. And she was like, oh, like I just actually thought that that was right. So it wasn't even that she was just incorrect in the moment. They've all been taught that that's correct.
Ah, got you. Oh,
Yeah.
that's super interesting.
Hmm.
Oh, man.
If you want to hear the example, it's like it can actually remember it. It's like the I think it's like the people who say that, yeah, and like the people who say that are thinking this or whatever.
Mm,
And as soon as it's who, she thought, and many other Swedes think that it becomes then is, like the people who is a singular. So the
right.
people who is here, blah blah blah, and they think that word who like is a magic thing into like single person tense. Um, but yeah, we would say, well, the people, so therefore are,
Uh,
or those trees are nice, not those trees who is nice. No,
right.
like
It's an interesting concept, the idea of just like listening to a non-native speaker and how, their own language comes out. I can think of a bunch of examples in Spanish, having gone
mm,
through that whole process and all. But that
yeah,
concept that you talked about is a linguistic concept. I studied like linguistics at a university here in Mexico City. I just
mm,
showed up and took the classes. Like you said, like
yeah,
finding interest things through your language, right?
yeah, yeah,
I can't remember what the name of it's called, but like the distance between how things are and you know.
yeah, yeah. I also have this like I'm sure I'm not the first person to come up with it, but this idea of like filters um, that go downways rather than upways are always easier. So that is when a language separates more concepts, um, or has more ways to express a particular item, like a particular noun or something, and then they are learning a language that has fewer of those ways or has fewer complex cases or whatever,
Mhm.
that will always be easier because it's just like, oh, all the times that we would say this, you guys just say this. Like we would say A, B, C, or D, but you guys just say this. Um, Whereas if you're going the other way, it's normally more complicated because it, even though you can get to a level where you're not translating, you still always sort of have that base language in your head.
Mm.
So that's the one. Like normally, Swedish is more complicated than English. For example, it has genders and English
Mhm.
doesn't. But that's one where Swedish is simpler. They only have one verb tense for
Wow.
everything. So that's if they're going to make a mistake, that's where it'll be. Whereas if an English speaker is going to make a mistake in Swedish, it'll often be with a gender or with one of the 17 words for before, where we only have the word before.
Right. Cool. One thing that I kind of consider here and there, yeah, I think it's actually pretty nice. So, my dad liked languages. Now, this was my dad before, I knew him because all the time I knew him, he just spoke English. My dad actually was from Mexico City. My mom's
Okay.
American, right? So I was born up there, but raised only with English. And I had
Mhm.
heard that my dad, studied English with a passion here in Mexico, that he went and lived in France for a time, studied French, of course, did a bit of Italian. So this told me, oh, my dad likes languages, right?
Mhm.
My mom studied to be a Spanish teacher, actually, and she
Mhm.
took a bit of Portuguese at school as well. So for me, like that tells me, well, there must be some kind of genetic component, not in terms of like my ability in languages, but
Mhm.
my what's the word I'm looking for? My affinity towards
Mhm.
languages, right? So I feel that coming to Mexico City, being in environments where another language is spoken kind of sparked that. And,
Yep.
of course, that became one of my main passions in my life. Your
Yep.
mother is an English professor, correct?
Hmm. Was, yeah. Yeah, I
Was.
mean, she's like long retired now, but yeah.
This would tell me that maybe your mother uh, didn't get into the realm of foreign language, but
Mhm.
she loved language enough for her to dedicate her professional life towards it. Do you feel that you have inherited a bit of love of language, perhaps through your mother? And maybe this has helped in some way in terms of just your passion towards language.
I mean, I don't want to sound too cliched, but I think it's more that a lot of people inherit their parents' curiosity about things. So actually thinking of pretty much all my family members, even going out to the small extended family that I have, um, almost all of them have shown an interest in language at some
Really?
point. Yeah,
Okay.
if not gone pretty full on with it. So and actually all of them have been reasonably full on at one point. So my brother
Wow.
went to Germany and only spoke like as in refused to use English, but this was like when I was really really young because he's quite a lot older than I am. And my mum did German at university when she was studying, and then she chose to specialize in like Old English, and so even
Oh,
old English really is a foreign language. I
of
don't know if
course,
you've ever
yeah.
seen Old English, but it's got nothing to do with modern English. But so so and then yeah, my dad has been interested in German and France and French. He lived in France when I first took up French, um,
Oh,
which
wow.
is why I took up. That's actually where the whole French thing came from.
That's why
That's
you
why I took
chose
it.
that one.
Yeah, that's why I chose French. Yeah.
Cool.
So and like it goes out further and further. I could name many examples, and but I think it's really just to do with like um, a reasonable number of Australians, uh, and I don't want to sort of I think it's a cultural thing. A reasonable number of Australians just don't see the point, really. Like
Oh,
they're just not curious about it. Um, like they just kind of go, that thing's in a foreign language. I can't read the foreign language, so I'm not gonna think about it, kind of thing. Whereas I was always like, even before I called language as my thing, I was always like looking for, trying to work out, for example, like if I saw a sign, a multilingual sign, I was always trying to like work out which one was which. I was like,
uh,
oh well, that okay, look at that one's German, I know that, and it's like, oh, I guess that, well, that one's French, or is it Spanish? Like this is back when I was a kid and I didn't know anything.
wow.
And then the challenge, the real challenge, was always trying to work out like which one was Chinese and which one was Japanese, because I had
Japanese.
absolutely no idea back then. Um, so like I think it's just a thing of curiosity, and if anything seems to have been inherited, it would be more like my dad's dad was a very low level concert pianist. So it looked like people kind of said, "Oh, you've got your grandpa's genes when it came to playing the piano." But really, I just think I had his curiosity and didn't have uh, hadn't played from like a little kid to when I was 25 like he did. But
That'll do the trick.
yeah, yeah. But I, it's really for everything for me. Like I actually have to, going back to what I was saying before about being into things for shorter periods of time, I have to deliberately switch off some elements of curiosity,
Oh
because
yeah.
otherwise I just can't, like I've just focused on everything for like one day. Um, so, for example, calligraphy is something that I've kind of, every time I see calligraphy, I'm like, that's awesome. But
Oh,
I'm deliberately not getting into it because I just don't have
absolutely.
time. Um,
100%.
yeah, so I don't, certainly no one in my family has ever been like, what's the word? Uh, I can't think of the proper word now, but sort of has ever discouraged me from languages. Um, but they now, uh, my mum, who's the one outside of the family I live with, like my wife and my kids, my mum is the one that I talk to most about Swedish, and
Ah,
she doesn't speak a word of Swedish, but she is really into Scottish stuff, like
oh,
really really
yeah.
into it. Um, and so she's often asking like, oh, what's their word for this, to see if she can work out like some links to old Scots English.
Hmm.
Um, or so I speak to her about it, and the only thing that kind of confuses the rest of my family about me now is uh like how hard I'm going in on this one obscure Nordic language kind of thing. Um like they, yeah, my brother was shocked to learn. He was like, "Wait, so you can like go and hang out with Swedish people and speak Swedish?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he's like, "There's so like what? Why so? Like you could learn this, so you could learn this, so you could learn." It's like, well, yeah, you could learn lots of things, but yeah.
um, and have you had a fair chance doing that? And if so, have you noticed the effects of using, let's say, a more colloquial register with them and the reactions towards that? How they
uh,
perceive it?
no, I haven't really had a good chance to do it since I've become better at it. I did it more at the beginning, um, when I was good at Swedish, but only for how long I'd studied it. Like I wasn't actually very good, and I didn't understand a lot of what was going on in the conversation. Um, and because, yeah, because of the situation that is ongoing in Australia, um, all the stuff that I used to meet them at has like sort of shut
Mm,
down. Um,
gotcha.
but I mean, I was never one to look at something that was written in a textbook and say, "Oh, well, that's right. I'm going to say that."
Hmm.
Um, and I've always been quite quick to pick up on like, oh, they're saying X, not Y.
Uh,
Um, so I'm quite good at kind of parroting, and even parroting stuff that I heard from like a movie, and I'll say that. Um, and yeah, that will impress them. I don't know if it will changed the way they speak Swedish to me. I haven't really noticed that, but
Mm.
like, yeah, just switching the like, it's completely correct in Swedish to say like, I don't think that, like, I don't agree with that, just like we would in English. But they're much more likely to say that do I not agree with.
Mm.
And so when
Of
I
course.
when I threw that in like after 5 months of learning Swedish, when they were saying like your Swedish is really good, and I said like that I don't agree with, they were like they were like
It's just
this guy's amazing. He does
Australian guys
yeah
blows Swedish
yeah
mind with
yeah
correct sentence structure.
yeah. But
Yeah.
otherwise, no, I can't really say I'm really. That's one thing. I haven't really been too affected by the situation, but I will say that I'm looking forward to the Swedish cafes opening up
Oh, how cool.
again, hopefully in summer and stuff, because they love summer here. And yeah, and going and testing my actual, like, actually better Swedish.
Right. For me, living in a place that speaks my target language,
Yep.
so like Mexico is the place where the most amount of Spanish speakers are, and in
Yep.
the capital, naturally, like that's where the biggest city where Spanish is spoken. And my Spanish is so it's like from the capital, it's called Chilango. It's like just kind of
Mhm.
named people from the capital,
Mhm.
and also kind of like the way of speaking or like the phrase, the vocabulary, all that. And I speak so much like that here, let's say in social situations and things like that, that people will just be like, oh, they'll be surprised that I'm using like this kind of language.
Mhm.
It's not like overly strange language, but it's language that they use here. And for me, just since that's where I live, it's like that's how it comes out, and people are like, "Oh, wow!" And for me, I'm like I'm surprised, and it takes me a second just to,
Yeah.
"Oh, okay, I get it." Oh,
As in they expect you to have learned a very formal kind of, is like a very normal correct Spanish. Is that what you mean?
yeah. Well, they just they think that they like it. They think that it's nice to see their style of
Mhm.
language reflected back to them from someone who doesn't speak that language from that
Yeah.
sorry that language in general
Yeah.
originally. So
Yeah.
I have to be like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, I get it. But
Yeah.
like when I'm speaking to someone from other countries, like I have to do the reverse. Like I have to like figure out all these ways to make it like a more neutral Spanish.
Yes. Yeah. Um, yeah. Did you want me to comment on that
No,
as to,
no, it
yeah,
was
no,
just
yeah,
my
no,
comments to
yeah, yeah, yeah,
no. Just my little contribution to the chat.
yeah, yeah.
Um, one thing that you talked about that I have so much experience with that like I really related to. Basically, you talked about how if you want the other person to speak to you, like, and let's say they have good English, you actually
Mhm.
kind of have to show them that you're really serious about speaking their language. Um, so, did you have these experiences, let's say, at these Swedish cafes, or you know, I thought maybe he
Uh,
has a lot of friends, or maybe there's a lot of Swedish people in Australia. I don't know, but I imagine you went through this process of let's speak Swedish, and they're like, okay, okay, oh, English, English. No, I really want to speak Swedish.
um, Not so, at the Swedish cafe in Sydney. I've noticed that that seems to be regarded as the one place where it's almost rude to speak English with anyone except someone who would not claim to be a Swedish speaker, because it's it's a tiny, tiny cafe, and it's in the middle of Sydney, and it's like you could go literally anywhere else to speak English. Like take about 3 steps and you're in English speaking territory. Um, so that's I've noticed one place where people will not revert to English. So that's actually it better than Sweden, because that's like where they go to kind of be Swedish. Um, but I mean, a few times I don't think they even realize they're doing it necessarily.
Mhm.
Like, because they understand you, and but they've just got this mind like, I'm in Australia and I can tell already that your Swedish isn't that great. So you'll say something to them and in Swedish, and they understand you, and they think, and they go like, yeah, I mean, well, that can be a problem, you know. And it's like, yeah, did you not hear me? Like I would just, and then very occasionally I've even had them like get to the end of their what they're saying and then go, oh, sorry, nej, vi ska prata svenska, det glömde jag. Like, you know, I just forgot that I forgot that you wanted to speak Swedish with me, kind of thing. Um, Not really, other than like very early, because I took a speak from day one approach.
Mm.
So other than like in the first kind of 3 months, um, when my Swedish was that bad that like I would ask them something like I'd put together this question and then they'd go, okay, I think this will be a bit complicated. I'll take this one in English. Um, Other than that, no, I haven't really had that problem greatly, but I was probably more referring to my experience in French when I said
Mm.
that, even though I may have used Swedish as an example
Ah,
because it's
okay.
definitely my stronger language. But like, yeah, I I think you have to kind of push back politely by just continuing to speak the language. But you know, I've seen weird things with extremely bilingual people where like I witnessed this conversation at a Scandinavian market thing that they had here in Sydney, which like all five Nordic countries, um, where like this guy was speaking Swedish and this guy was speaking Finnish, which don't even resemble each other, right? Um, and and like they obviously understood each other fine, but they just prefer to speak their native language. So it was like I listened for like 2 minutes, kind of from an oblique angle where they couldn't see that I was listening. And it's like this guy speaking Swedish, and I was like, yeah, I understand what he's saying. And then the other person would just go, and just like say something in Finnish. I was like, this is the most amazing conversation I've ever seen. Like, but you know, so I think most people who aren't there for linguistic reasons, don't even necessarily notice what they are, which language they're using
Of
if they're
course.
proficient in both. And so it's just a matter of um, kind of telling them that why you're there. It's like I'm here for a language thing. Um, so yeah, I guess
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
takeaway.
Right. And yeah, I mean, they could be kind of disheartening, but at the same time, it's not necessary to take it personally. Sometimes, if you're at a party and, they see a foreigner, they're like, oh, hey, hey. And, you're just rolling out your Spanish, let's say. And, they're speaking English. I'm, hey, man, let's speak Spanish. I'm trying to practice on that. And they're like, oh, see. And then it's just like flip right back in English. I think it's just
Yeah,
like the moment, they're not taking it too
yeah,
seriously.
yeah, and like the other thing, and I've made this point in the video, Swedes will say a lot of stuff in English even when they're talking to other Swedish people, and there can be various reasons for that. Um, one of them, if it's like a whole thing, like often it's a quote from a movie or like a meme or something, um, and that kind of indicates that it's like this is not this is an idea I'm expressing right now. I'm not actually saying this. If I was saying this for real, then I would say it in Swedish because the
Mm-hmm.
conversation is in Swedish. But like, um, it's how like this line has become famous, like from Home Alone, the movie Home
Oh,
Alone,
how I love that.
um, um, where he's like, I don't think so. So Swedes will just be like fluent, just having fluent Swedish. Men vad skulle du tro att han skulle flytta dit? Nej, I don't think so, kind of thing. Like, yeah, and they
That's
could
cool.
just say that in Swedish, but yeah. So it's like it's I've found that part of learning Swedish is understanding where English is appropriate and where it would actually
Exactly.
sound even more Swedish to throw something in English in. And all I have to remember
100%.
then is that Swedes don't have Australian accents. So even if their English is like native level perfect, which it very occasionally is, then I have to do it in an American accent because they don't speak Australian English. So it
Oh.
does sound weird if I go from speaking fluent Swedish to just saying like, yeah, and that's what I think. It's like, that's not what they sound like. So yeah.
No, that's it. That's another interesting aspect. I haven't really heard too many people talk about that, but just like where, let's say, a foreign language enters, well, the foreign language that you're
Hmm.
speaking, in my case,
Yeah.
Spanish, and how does English have its influences? Like, there is a point where I'm like, oh, hey, I'm just gonna try to use, the Spanish word for that, but it's like, all right, you could do that, but like everyone just says this one English word.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. There's so many in Swedish, and like I've started to, and not that I've spoken to many Swedes recently, but I've started to kind of almost start impressing Swedes with like my knowledge of like weird Swedish vocabulary, or they would consider it weird if they're a bit younger,
Mm,
because they're like, oh, we just say arbitrary. And it's like they actually just say arbitrary.
wow.
Where the Swedish word for that is godtycklig. And it's like nothing to do with the word arbitrary, but some of them are like, you say godtycklig, and they're like, liksom arbitrary. And you're like, yeah, yeah. Um, but yeah, so I sort of, I hope to become a little bit like a little bit like Matt versus Japan in that regard. In that, like he started knowing word, well, he got to a level where he knew words that natives didn't know.
Right.
Um, and so it's actually quite easy in Swedish because some of the younger ones don't have a very broad vocabulary in Swedish because they spend all their time on the internet watching stuff in English.
Right. But
Mm.
yeah, I really related to what you said about just like pushing through, because like that's what I had to do. Years ago when I was here, I started off in like the international circle. Then there came a time where I was like, oh man, I'm here in Mexico. I got to take advantage of this. I want to speak Spanish,
Mm.
and I kind of like stepped away from that. I've always had one really good Mexican friend who speaks amazing English, and I always felt like I disappointed him because like he had his friend to speak English with. I'm like, oh,
Oh,
maybe
yeah.
I speak Spanish. I have an Argentinian friend who, for me, is like the clearest example of a near native speaker of any language that I've heard.
Hmm.
And, this kind of took more work of, hey man, speak Spanish to me, speak Spanish to me. But once you kind of, I don't want to say train them, but show enough persistency that, you know, they really stick to it. I could be in a group of like in a conversation in English with just a bunch of foreigners. And if my friend's there, the Argentinian, like he'll just say something to me in Spanish as if I were an Argentinian or
Yeah.
a native. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah. Yep, totally. Yeah, there's so many aspects to it, and you need not take it as, like you said, you need not take it personally that if they're insisting on speaking English with you, that it means your Spanish is really bad. It can be lots of things. Like,
Mm-hmm.
um, even there's, I forget what this concept's called, but there's something about like the first language you ever spoke to them. Like
Exactly.
if that lasted more than a few minutes, then it starts becoming weird to speak anything else. So I interviewed a Polish woman on my channel like 4 months ago, um, but in Swedish because her Swedish is amazing.
The one that blew your
Um,
mind, right?
yeah, yeah. Um, but then I spoke, and like we chat on Instagram regularly and stuff, and mostly we use Swedish, despite the fact that she lives in London.
Cool.
Um, but then I interviewed her again, and I this time we did it in English, and she said straight away, she's like, "Oh, it's weird to be speaking English to you," even though as a total like comfort level, her comfort and my comfort is probably higher because her Swedish is only a bit better than her English, and my English is obviously a lot better. It was still weird. Like
Right.
it was totally weird, even for me, to be speaking English to someone I know as like a Swedish speaking person.
Right.
So that can come into it. So, and the context, like what city are you in? If you're in Mexico City, it's probably going to be normal to speak Spanish. And are there other Spanish speakers who don't speak English around? And
Right. And for that reason that you said about, the language that you start the relationship in, that's
mm,
the language it usually stays in. That's why I was always so grateful for my best Mexican friend, because like he really took the time just to have patience with me. And because having that one friend, I really learned a lot from him. people talk
Mm.
about, I mean, language parents. I didn't try to like copy him, but I learned
Yep.
so much from him just by him switching over, you know? So
Yep. Yep.
it's
Totally.
quite wonderful. So you said you have been studying only Swedish for about over a year now, all right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one thing I want to know is in this time, what what's something or some things about the process of language learning that that have been revealed to you during this time that had you just stayed with French and Swedish, you may not have discovered?
Um, I don't know about the process of language learning, if I've discovered so much about that, but um, I think the level to which I can get to to get my brain to function in Swedish, not that we think actually in a language, um, but the level that I can get my automatic reaction to be in Swedish and stuff is surprised me,
Mm.
in that I thought it was purely a time thing. Like it's like, okay, well, I haven't got time to study French and Swedish, so I'm just going to study Swedish. But after a while, like maybe it's a result of the time, I don't know. But when I spent enough time in Swedish, I would start to. It's almost like it started becoming my native language in certain settings.
Oh.
Um, as in, like, so my computer's in Swedish. Sorry, just my computer is in Swedish, and it had been for a while, but I would still often kind of read things on it and be like, what, why is this coming up? Like, I'd know what it was saying, but I'd kind of go, what, I don't, this is annoying, kind of thing, whatever it is with the computer. But these days, I guess I've now spent enough time in Swedish that I'll see something and like be completely concerned with the meaning of what I'm seeing. And this is happening with lots of stuff, not just my computer, but like lots of things where I'll read something in Swedish, comments on YouTube. I'm starting to get a lot of comments from Swedes, and be totally engulfed in like the meaning. So the computer will say like, there's been an error, this program's got to shut or whatever. And before it was like, it was in Swedish and I was like, oh no, there's been an error, kind of thing. Whereas now I read it and I'm like, nej men det här är helt galet, jag sparade den precis, kind of thing. And it's like, and I'm not even thinking about like, oh, all my reactions are in Swedish and stuff, which is like, yeah, I was doing that before, but I would always have this thing of like, oh, I have an opportunity to kind of react to this in Swedish. Whereas now I'm just like reacting to it raw, and it'll only be if I kind of something takes me out of that. Like if my son goes like, is everything okay or something? And I'm like, no, but no, it's not. This is annoying. Or what, and yeah, the same with, because I speak Swedish to my son, my youngest son, the baby, and my older son is picking up on some of that, and he's starting to use a little bit. But so my wife will hand me something while I've got him in my arm or something, and I'll be like, oh man, tuck. Like, it's just, and I don't even notice I'm doing it until there's something that comes a second later where I'm like, I just spoke Swedish to my wife, who's total doesn't speak Swedish. Yeah, just the level to which you can get your kind of reactions and this subconscious hum of your brain, like just with thoughts and stuff, to be in Swedish has surprised me, and something that I've really wanted to take up, because when I did full-time Swedish last year, I think just after you did,
Mm-hmm.
I still always felt like there was like that, I'm deliberately spending time in a language that's not comfortable. Whereas now I feel like Swedish is very comfortable, and I would like to see what would happen again if I were to do that. Yeah, like I think this time would be very different, and it would really kick that. I just think that subconscious process goes deeper and deeper and deeper to like Inception, to levels that you don't even know existed, kind of thing. Yeah.
That must also be interesting to talk to your son in Swedish because you talk about this idea of reaction. And I mean, you have a human that you can kind of react to. And I think that's almost as if for a moment you were in Sweden, for example, you know, and you're just reacting. Um, so that's interesting. I mean, that gives you like a level of language usage that I mean, some people are not going to have that study a language outside of their target country. So that's
Yeah.
cool.
Well, I think it's going to be really hard um, to get him to actually speak Swedish because he's still just surrounded by English so often.
Of course.
Um, but I'm really keen to try my absolute best so that um, I've got someone who, firstly, to give him an advantage of like being bilingual from birth, but also just to have someone with whom the default relationship is Swedish. And that's already the case, except that at the moment he doesn't talk. Or he says like four things, and all of them are words that could be like we wouldn't even know which language it was because there's mama, but I don't wouldn't say that he says it like mama like that. He goes like mum 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 mum, and that could be mum or it could be mama. So yeah, I'm keen to see what happens with that and see if I can build it to the point that's like I actually spend almost just by looking after him in his toddler years, I spend almost as much time in Swedish in my life as I do in English. And yeah.
And that was the idea to start speaking to your son, just that he could grow up with another language. This was the initial idea.
Yeah, and that's part of what led me to drop French and focus on
Um,
Swedish was that he was about to be born, and at the time I was like, "Oh, my French is pretty good. I think I could, if I focused on that, I could really bring my French up." But then I was like, "No, I really just have had less time with French, and it's not as comfortable." And this sounds weird, but it's actually easier to get some level of Swedish schooling here where I live than it is
really?
to get French schooling. There is a very famous French school in Sydney, but I don't live in Sydney. That's too far to go for school. But there are little Swedish communities in most of the cities that do like they don't do school, but they do like before and after school care.
Uh-huh.
Um, and the rule is that the kid, to even attend, the kid actually has to come from a Swedish speaking background. Um, so that was part of it, and also like Swedish is further removed from English than French is.
Uh-huh.
I believe that French is the closest
Uh,
existing language to English. Um, so there was that. So I was like, well, that's more bilingual than like the ultimate would be like Arabic and English or Japanese and English,
yeah.
but like Swedish and English is more bilingual than French and English, where it's almost just like the same but with different pronunciation. Um,
Uh-huh. Right.
so every a lot of things came into it, but uh, yeah, and just I mean, why not? A lot of people were asking me like, "Oh, you speak a couple of languages. Are you going to speak to your kids in one of them?" And again, that was like, well, now I need to focus on one because like I don't actually speak a couple of languages. I just sort of dabble in a couple of languages almost. Like people underestimate the level to which you need to speak a language to speak to kids in it, because like you know the speed at which you say something, it's like a raw reaction of um, like, oh, careful about, don't trip over that, buddy. Oh, mate, you hit your head or whatever. Like that's what we would say in Australia. Like, it sounds bad, but my son is clumsy. He hits his head all the time. um,
It's funny
you
those
know,
things.
they're called toddlers for a reason, but it's like all that stuff, and it's like, okay, I can say like you hit your head, but is that the Swedish expression for
Hmm.
like to bang your head on something like a
Exactly.
floor or something? Is that what it is? Because it might not. Like I'm more and more discovering that it's not that. Uh, or to change his nappy in Swedish, they don't say change his nappy; they just say change nappy.
Mm.
And it's like it doesn't matter what the article, all this technical stuff. Um, so it's a massive level. Kids stuff is actually really hard.
I can see that. And actually, I find this topic a bit interesting because you're going through something that I think that one day I will go through. Um, I've had a couple Spanish native girlfriends, and I thought, oh, maybe one day, if we get married and have kids, you know, that'll take care of that because the mom will just speak Spanish and boom. I mean, but
Yeah.
let's say I marry an English speaker, a speaker of whatever language, it is my responsibility to endow my child with Spanish, which is something that I want to do,
Mm.
right? So I think of all these situations, and I'm like, because the force of the native language is just like so crazy.
Yeah.
So you think about how can you achieve such a goal, and the only thing that I've come up with up to this point is just like have all their entertainment, like all of their good
Exactly.
times, be in this language. So they associate good times with this language.
Yeah, yeah, and I do that, and yeah, so anyone watching will be like, if, what does this guy really hope to like overcome English with? Yeah, no, we watch. It's I generally think like a lot of screen time, especially at this young age, is like not a good thing. But I
Uh,
kind of think that we do all our screen time is spent in Swedish. So um, there's a bunch of good stuff on SVT Play, which is their kind of free thing. That's Sweden's free entertainment service. There's a bunch of good stuff on that, and even my older son now has discovered it. It's an American show, but it's dubbed into Swedish that he really likes. So he started watching that. So I'm hoping to also get him in that golden age of like 10 to
right.
15, which is like, that's amazing if because their brains are like developed enough that they can start figuring out patterns, but not so indoctrinated in English that like they can't figure out like, no, why did they say that and not this? And I can already see him picking stuff up, and like he says stuff that he's just parroting me or something he's seen on TV. This is the older one.
Okay.
um and I'm like, yep, that was correct. Like,
Oh,
yeah, so I agree. Yeah, all entertainment in the target language, totally.
for sure. Man, oof, what a adventure that'll be. And
Mm.
what's really cool about that, from my perspective, is that maybe I'm not so interested to watch all that stuff right now to absorb that language, which
Mhm.
makes you near native.
Yeah,
But us as language learners will learn so much just by
yeah,
this quality time with our children. We're going to learn all these things that maybe we would have growing up there. Not everything, but nice amounts. So you're
yeah.
like learning, like turning back the hands of time a little bit.
Yeah, because you can actually get more interested in something simply by way of like the person you're showing it to is more interested in it. So like I would not sit and watch shows for toddlers by myself, but when I watch it with him, I kind of pick up on his curiosity a little bit. Um, because that's just because you're like, I wonder what he thinks about that. And there's also a ton of vocabulary that you kid yourself that but that you don't. I mentioned one with Aaron from Fingtam Languages.
Mm,
I said slippery dip, but that's not even the same in all the. So in US English, I think it's slide, as in like the
mm,
thing you sit on top and
I
go down.
understand now.
And yeah, yeah, exactly. So like that, it's like, do you know that in your target language? Probably not, unless you've got a kid or something. So
Right.
there's a lot of that, but it's all, yeah, I just believe that you pick up on their curiosity, whereas if you were just sitting watching a show for toddlers when you're in your mid 30s, well, in my case, in my mid 30s, be like, what are you doing? um,
Exactly. Um, it's fun to listen, living in Mexico, it's fun to listen to kids and how they speak. Because, you get that language that maybe you wouldn't get otherwise. One of the
oh,
kids
totally.
that I learned, I was at some place and the little 3-year-old was playing with his father, and his father had a big stomach, and he says, basically like the Mexican kid version of like sucking your gut would be like, make yourself skinny,
Yeah, yeah,
make
yeah.
yourself. I'm like, oh, Hazte flaco. Oh, I like that. I like make yourself skinny, Dad.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. Yeah, there's so much. Oh man, I really hope I can get him to speak Swedish because my first son was like a gold mine of funny things to say in English from when he was about 2 to when he was like 7.
Really?
Uh, like even though like from when he was 2 to 4, it was obviously like weird non-idiomatic English, or he'd say things that like I can see what you're trying to say, but from 4 to 7, it was just straight up like funny, like it was like correct English,
My.
but just funny thoughts about the world. So I would love. I don't care which language he speaks. Actually, I'm just looking forward to having that again in any language.
Of course. And one thing I realize is that, you know, I'm going to pass on Spanish, but, you know, let's say right now I'm studying Russian. Maybe someday I'll study another language. I'm not going to force languages on my kid. I'm not going to say you have to say this. I want my kid
Yeah.
just like come up with Spanish, right? And if something
Yep.
blossoms from there, wonderful. But if not, you know, they've got this like lineage
Yep.
thing going on.
Yep. You can't force it anyway. Like I mean, I've seen so many attempts to do it that it just like. I mean, Chinese parents are famously strict, and I've been in, or at least here in Australia, I don't know about it, but not strict like as in strict with like getting their kids to study and practice violin and whatever. Like, and I've been in libraries here in Australia where the parent is talking to the kid in Chinese, and the kid just clearly understands, but then just turns around and responds in like completely idiomatic English, like like no, Dad, I'm doing this now, kind of thing. It's like if I don't know if you're trying to get them to speak Mandarin, but it's not working.
Oh
Like,
my gosh. I know. I've thought of those situations like, man, I don't want to be the person that's like, speak Spanish, dang
yeah,
it, you know, but like, I think it's going to be such like a difficult situation. So that's why like I have that idea of like, all right, associate fun. I mean, give it your best shots.
yeah,
Maybe travel, take the kid with you here and there when you go to Mexico or some Spanish speaking
yeah.
country, make the language real.
Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Yeah, because that shows them that it's not just like my weird parents who just like speak this thing that no, they think it's like a language of the family.
Uh-huh.
And you go and you're actually like, well, more people speak. Is it more people speak Spanish worldwide than English? I think it's more,
As
isn't it?
native speakers.
As native speakers, yeah, yeah.
And making a language real is something that I know I've discovered. And you know, English natives have the fame of, well, not being interested in languages.
Mm,
I mean, I think, well, if they had the exposure, like that little thing to turn it on, a lot more would be because, you know, for me, I still find it's just fascinating that hola is hello and como estás is how are you. Hey, I learned that in school. You mean that was
mm.
correct? You know, so for me,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
surprising that that was correct, you know?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, and see, I like the curiosity for me comes from then, and this was something that wouldn't have happened before I got into Swedish and then French, but like it's like I might be about to embarrass myself badly, but I believe that como estás is literally like how and then to be, but to be conjugated with you, right?
Mm.
So like in English you can't say that exactly. You can't say how is it? You can
Mhm.
actually, but like I
How
love
is
that
it
in
to you?
yeah,
Or,
exactly. Because, but all because of that. And I've noticed that even like, I don't learn Spanish, but I've noticed that in a few movies I've watched that are in Spanish, it's like, oh, they can imply who is doing the thing without even saying who,
mhm.
just with the conjugation, which is kind of awesome.
Right.
Um, and like completely the opposite of Swedish, where it's like the conjugation doesn't tell you anything, even less than English. Um, so yeah, and that's like it just sets off that curiosity. Whereas like in school, I was probably a bit more like just because I was a kid, I was probably a bit more like, oh well, they told you that it's como estas, so that's what it is.